Welcome everyone. I know some colleagues are still joining the webinar, but as it's past 1 o'clock now, we'll make a start. So my name is Linda Bald. I'm co-director of Behavioural Research UK, along with Professor Susan Mickey, who I'll introduce in a moment. We're really pleased you've taken the time to join us today. This is a research showcase, and what we intend to do is present key findings and also explain the methods and approach to what we called our demonstration projects. And these were 5 early stage projects conducted from the beginning of BR UK's funding, really throughout the first 18 months of our funding period. And for some of the projects, we're still working on those outputs and dissemination. And they have informed the later stages of our work, in which we'll be sharing more about in future webinars. So just a couple of points of housekeeping for me, and then I'll hand over to Susan. So the webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website later, so everybody can see them. And the Q&A box won't be visible in the recording, but I'll explain on the next slide how you can ask questions during the webinar. And you can ask those questions anonymously. So we're going to meet for 90 minutes and we'll make sure that we finish on time. As I mentioned, the video and audio, and importantly, the chat is disabled for the purposes of a webinar. If you'd like to ask a question, and we'd really encourage you to put a question in the Q&A box when you're listening to our presenters, and we received a few in advance, indicating who it's for, or if it's just a general question, that's fine, but other people can upvote your questions so we can see the ones that people particularly want to be answered. So please do upvote other people's questions. And if you need closed captioning, importantly, but you cannot see this on your screen automatically, please click the CC box on your Zoom menu bar. So thank you again from me, and I'll hand over now to Susan.
Thank you very much, Linda. So here you see how we're proposing to organise our time together. People will have just a short time to present the work, and then we'll have 10-minute Q&As halfway through, and then 2 more will be presented, and then we'll have much longer Q&As, 25 minutes. So do just put the Q&A questions in the Q&A box as we go forward. So delighted for the first presenter to present Dr. Shaun Helman, who's from the Transport Research Laboratory, and is going to talk about behavioural interventions to reduce speeding amongst drivers and riders of motor vehicles. Shaun, over to you.
Thanks, Susan. So yeah, as Susan said, this is some work we've been doing on the BR UK programme about reducing speeding. Now I'm going to talk about 2 things today. If you have the next slide, my co-presenter George Beard will be here for the panel later, but I'm just going to run through the slides for now. So I'm going to talk about 2 things that we've done on the project so far. The first thing we did was an evidence review using an ontological approach. Now, I'm not going to say much about that because the next presenter is going to cover that in much more detail, but I'll just give that at the end as an example of one of the pieces of work we've done using that approach and that is now published. And what I want to spend time talking about today is the on-road pilot that we've done, which is a pilot to, as it says there, test methods of measuring speeds in the real world to support a later piece of work. So next slide, please. Yeah, and the background to all of this is that speeding is known to be a big problem in terms of road safety. It's one of the fundamental issues in road safety that results in an increase in collisions and injuries. And we know also that part of the answer to reducing speeding is to change beliefs, not just to do other things like, for example, enforcement. We need to get to a place, we think road safety practitioners are increasingly realizing that we need to get to a place where the public see slower speeds as part of the sort of normal behavior that we want to see. And there's one very important reason for that. So it's not just to do with speeding per se, but it's also to do with getting the speeds at which traffic travels down to more survivable speeds for impacts in collisions, especially with vulnerable road users. Another point that we're trying to look at here is that, again, in road safety, we do quite a lot of work with surrogate measures, and we feel actually we need to have a better understanding of actual real world behaviour, especially when we're looking to calculate things like return on investment, where we've got multiple interventions we could employ, understanding which of those gives us the best outcomes given the budgets we have. So that's what this on-road pilot really focused on. It tested 2 methods of real-world measurement of speeds, and also used an intervention as part of the pilot, informed by the literature review that we did, which I'll come back to. Next slide. So we used 2 ways of measuring speeds in this piece of work. Now, the work was carried out in something called the Smart Mobility Living Lab in London, which is a real-world test bed. It's got around 24 kilometres of instrumented roads with cameras and various other sensors. You can see some examples there on the picture in the top left of the map. But basically, lots of those columns around this environment with various sensors and cameras that we can use to essentially understand what's going on in that environment. And part of the software suite of the Smart Mobility Living Lab is something called an object detection algorithm. Now, there are lots of object detection algorithms out there. This particular one was originally designed to track test vehicles around the lab. And what we did with this work is looked at whether that could be used to measure speeds of a sort of population of traffic on a given road at a given time. Now, that data is still being analysed. I'm not going to say much about it today. I'm going to talk about, on the next slide, please, the other approach that we used in the project, which was to use real-world connected vehicle data. So this is data that all vehicles are out there collecting, and in many cases this data is given to data aggregators. The one we used for this work was a company called Compass IoT, and what that can do is give us very fine detailed data for a small sample of vehicles on the road. So you've got these 2 sort of approaches where we're using the infrastructure of cameras around the SMLL to look at all the vehicles on the road, versus the telematics approach, which is giving us more detailed data for a subsample. Next slide, please. Okay, and yeah, the design of this study, as I say, it's a pilot study. It's not really designed to be its own study in its own right, other than to test the approach that we aim to use in a later, larger study. So what we did with this work is we defined a very small section of road to measure speeds on, and that's on the map there, the A206. We had a control site, which was the westbound carriageway of that road, and then a trial site, which was the eastbound carriageway, downstream and upstream of this sign that we can see here in the picture. This sign was informed by the literature review. We know that something called descriptive norms are an important factor that determines how people behave in the real world. So just for those of you who don't know, a descriptive norm is simply a sort of perceived normal behavior, the sorts of things we see people doing around us. That's a description of normal behavior, and we know that people follow that behavior in the absence of any other pressures to change. So that was the intervention we used just for this pilot, and essentially we looked at data both before and after the installation of the sign. If we could have the next slide, please. So key findings so far, and we're working on publishing this by the end of the year, but it's all currently being looked at. So the first finding is that the aggregated data from, remember, I'm only talking about the telematics data now, maps really well, really neatly to the pilot location. You can see all the data points on the map on the right there. We also find a distribution of speeds that we would expect to see on this type of road. So lots of very slow traffic when the traffic is congested, but also lots of occasions when there is free flow conditions for people to choose their own speeds as well. Next slide, please. Good alignment from the speed data as well with GPS data. So we're able to test directly by looking at physical measurements and calculating speeds themselves, and we find very good alignment from the telematics data with that check. And then the work in progress at the moment is understanding the characteristics of this data and also the object detection data to understand what kind of trials they would support and what kind of study designs they would support. So this is things like statistical power calculations and so on, to ensure that we can use those data sources to support a larger trial. Next slide, please. And yeah, the next steps will be that trial. So this trial will be run over the next couple of years. And the idea is that we take everything we've learned in the BRUK project so far around vehicle speed and attitudes to speed and the beliefs that people hold about speed, and develop and implement in the real world a sort of an ongoing intervention that's designed to change people's beliefs around speeding, and then using the methods I've described in the pilot, follow those people and indeed wider traffic out into the real world to really understand what are the links between those surrogate measures of beliefs, how we can change those, and how those translate into real world behaviour in quite fine detail. So that's the plan for the next piece of work. Next slide, please. And I'll just finish by talking I think about the literature review. So yeah, this is the ontological evidence review that we did. That's just a few details about that piece of work. 30 studies with speeding interventions. These are interventions that are designed to change motivations and capabilities around speeding. And we looked at over 2,000 individual annotations in the end in those 30 studies. And I think this method of analysing evidence and synthesising evidence is going to be a really important part of growing in road safety the lessons we learn from the behaviour change and behavioural science literatures. We've got a history over the last decade of improving our use of that evidence base, and this is one further part of that. And I think the next slide is just a QR code which you can scan to take you to that publication. So I'll just leave that there for a few seconds while I say thank you. And I believe, Susan, you are going to now introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Shaun, thank you very much. And a really important foundation for what I'm sure will be a very valuable programme of research. And some of you may be wondering what the word ontology meant when Shaun referred to the systematic review evidence being organised by an ontology. And all will become clear now as I introduce Dr. Harriet Baird, who's going to talk about leveraging the benefits of ontologies for behavioural research. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, so as Susan says, my name's Harriet Baird, and I'm a lecturer in psychology from the University of Sheffield. But today I'm actually presenting on behalf of a much bigger team that you can see on the screen here. So the aim of this project was to explore the ways in which we can help researchers in the social and behavioural sciences better organise, connect and apply knowledge by leveraging the use of ontologies. So before I explain what ontologies are and how they can help us move behavioural research forward, let's take a quick look at some of the challenges that we're currently facing. So first, our data and evidence are growing faster than we as humans can keep up with. So over the years, we've gathered an incredible amount of information, but without better ways to organise and connect our knowledge, we haven't really been able to make the most of this data to drive progress. Second, we have a lack of precision and conceptual clarity. So the way that we describe and report our findings, our constructs and our data can be inconsistent, it can be vague, it can be ambiguous, and it can be missing in key details. And this makes it really difficult for others to fully understand, integrate and build upon our work. And finally, our theories, data and insights aren't well connected. It's really hard to find out what work's already been done, where things might overlap, or how to bring it all together. And to make this even more challenging, our research is actually spread across various different fields from psychology, sociology, economics, anthropology, and so on. And essentially, all of this makes it really difficult to bring our knowledge together and to try to tackle these really complex questions that behavioural research seeks to answer, and ultimately then turn our research into real-world impacts. Next slide, please. So what is an ontology? Well, an ontology is a structured way of organising and defining constructs within a field and the relationships between them using a shared language. So you can think of an ontology as a very sophisticated and interconnected dictionary or taxonomy for a field of study. Now, importantly, each construct within an ontology has a label that names the construct, a clear definition for that construct, a unique identifier or URI, and a list of properties associated with that construct. And specifying information in this way allows our knowledge to be understood not only by humans, but also by computers and machines. Next slide, please. So how can ontologies help us address some of the challenges that we're facing today? Well, ontologies provide clear and consistent labels and definitions for our constructs and the things that we study. So this helps to reduce that conceptual confusion. Second, by standardizing knowledge and information in this way, ontologies make it easier for us to link our data and evidence and theories across different teams, different disciplines, different data sets, and so on. And importantly, ontologies also ensure that our data and knowledge can be read by humans and machines, which means that once our knowledge has been represented in an ontological form, we can then use tools in AI to extract, synthesize, and analyze our information much more efficiently and with much greater precision. So essentially, ontologies help us represent information with clarity, consistency, and coherence, allowing us to connect our data and ideas and build this cumulative knowledge. Next slide, please. So ontologies in the social and behavioural sciences are still in their infancy, but through this project, we've been exploring how we can use ontologies to make our work more precise and better connected. And specifically, we've been looking at three things. So first of all, how can we identify ontologies that might be relevant to our work and identify where ontologies might overlap? Second, how can we use ontologies to help us find relevant data sets and then integrate these data sets when needed? And finally, how can we use ontologies to compare and integrate theories of behaviour and behaviour change? And we think these strands of work really align with the core foundations of behavioural science, so our constructs, our data and our theories. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with, why do we need a way to identify overlaps between ontologies? Well, it's not possible for one ontology to contain every single phenomena that we study in the social and behavioural sciences. So different ontologies have been developed that focus on different aspects. So for example, we have an ontology to describe behaviour change interventions, an ontology to describe addiction research, and an ontology to describe emotions and social interactions. But often these ontologies end up describing similar or overlapping ideas. Next slide, please. So to use an example, here are two constructs from two different ontologies, and I'd like us to think about whether these constructs are the same, similar, or different. So both of these constructs use the exact same label of social identity, but they have different unique identifiers and their definitions are a little different. So the question is, are these concepts from different ontologies identical and referring to precisely the same thing? Are they not identical but similar enough that they could be combined? Or are they expressing important differences? Now, we know that the goal of ontologies is to create a shared knowledge and understanding, but this isn't going to be possible if we have multiple ontologies that overlap in unclear ways. Now, that's not to say that we have to agree on every single definition, and both of these definitions are good, but using ontologies encourages us to be explicit about if, why, and how our constructs differ. Next slide, please. So this is why we developed a method and a step-by-step guide to help people identify when constructs from different ontologies may overlap. And you can read more about this work and access the guide that we created here. Next slide, please. So next, we wanted to explore how we can use ontologies to help us find relevant data sets and then integrate these data sets when needed. So across the social and behavioural sciences, we have hundreds and thousands of data sets spanning lots of related fields, and that number keeps growing every single day. So as I said before, we've amassed an incredible amount of information, but we haven't been able to make the use of this data to drive progress. And this is because we face a number of challenges. So we struggle to find data sets that include the constructs we care about. We find it difficult to figure out what the variables in a data set really mean and how they might relate to our constructs of interest. And we find it challenging to combine similar variables across different data sets in order to bring our knowledge together. So essentially, there's a lot of data out there, but sifting through what's relevant to us and how we can combine our data to provide more robust answers takes a lot of time and effort. Next slide, please. And this is where ontologies can help. So we can use ontologies to label, define, and structure the variables in our data set. So to do this, we developed a data schema, which is essentially a blueprint for what information is in a data set and how it's structured. So we call it SODA, which stands for Schema for Ontology-Based Dataset Annotation. And SODA essentially captures all the key details about the variables in a dataset in this structured and organised way. We can then use SODA to label our own datasets, to search for datasets that might be of interest to our work, and to combine the data in meaningful and useful ways. And essentially, once we've used ontologies to annotate our datasets, then we can harness the tools in AI to help us extract, combine, and analyse our data more efficiently. Next slide, please. And then this paper here describes the development of SODA and provides guidance on how you can implement this data schema for your own research. Next slide, please. So the final way we've been working with ontologies is to help compare and integrate theories of behaviour and behaviour change. Now, we all know that theories are incredibly useful. They help us summarise what we know and they help us build on existing knowledge. But we have a big problem. In the social and behavioural sciences, we don't just have a couple of theories, we have more than 80 theories of behaviour and behaviour change. And while that might sound like a field that's thriving, it actually creates a real challenge. So many of these theories overlap, they use different terms to describe essentially the same constructs or ideas, or they include constructs that aren't clearly defined at all. And until recently, there's been no way of assessing if and where these theories overlap. So instead of helping us move forward, this abundance of theories is actually holding us back. It's making it harder for us to compare findings, to integrate knowledge, and to apply our theories consistently to advance the field. Next slide, please. So if you thought that we had a lot of theories, we have got even more constructs. So working with colleagues from the Apricot project and an interdisciplinary team of anthropologists, sociologists and computer scientists, we extracted almost 1,500 constructs from 76 theories of behaviour and behaviour change. So that's a lot of constructs to try to make sense of. So what we did is mapped each construct to the behaviour change intervention ontology, which allowed us to define every construct and its relationship in precise terms and with a computer readable ID. Next slide, please. Once we've done this, we could then create a searchable database that allows users to explore different theories and the concepts within these theories, and then importantly, where they overlap. So for example, I could search for a specific construct I'm interested in. So let's say social identity again, and the database pulls up all of the details about that construct in an ontology form. Next slide, please. I could also see which theories include this construct. So there's a great visualization tool that lets you select the theories you're interested in and see where they overlap. So here you can see that social identity appears in both the social influence model, which is in orange, and the social identity theory, which is in turquoise. So essentially, by mapping constructs to ontologies, you can instantly see how different theories connect and where they might overlap. Next slide, please. So again, you can read more about this work, and this work is going to continue to be taken forward by the BR UK team and the Apricot project. Next slide, please. So we know that working with ontologies isn't straightforward, but there are lots of tutorials, tools and resources to make working with ontologies easier. And we've included some links to helpful guides and online materials here. So during the BR UK project, we're going to keep applying and trying to refine these methods to essentially make working with ontologies easier for behavioural science. Thank you very much. I think I'll pass back to Susan to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Harriet. Good. So you will get these slides later so that you can follow up on the resources. And just to say, don't forget to put any questions that you have as you go through these presentations in the Q&A box. And we had a few in advance. We put just 3 up here. So again, do upvote those if you would like to. And we'll come back to your questions as a priority if you submit them. Otherwise, we'll take ones that have been submitted in advance. So delighted to introduce Maggie Yang, who's going to talk about, we're moving to environmental behaviours now, so population segments and regional patterns of environmental behaviours. Maggie, over to you, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Guanyu from UCL, working with colleagues at UCL and Edinburgh on this project. So this is our multi-level analysis study of an OECD survey on environmental behaviors and policy support. Next slide, please. So we are all facing an imminent climate crisis where energy, transport, and food sectors are the major contributors. To address this, countries often look across internationally to see what works in other countries and then try to apply the same lessons to their own regional or national context. But this could mean another challenge. Policies might not work well when transferred between the borders. And this might be attributed to population heterogeneity. That is, different groups often behave differently in their everyday life and respond differently to environmental policies. For example, carbon tax might have worked in some places, but it might have led to the social unrest, such as the Yellow Vest protest in France. So our questions are, what environmental behavioral patterns exist? Who and where are they? And how do they relate to policy support? What does it mean for policy transfer across countries and regions? Next. So we analyzed a secondary dataset of a 2022 OECD survey with over 17,000 respondents across 9 countries, including the US, Canada, UK, Israel, and several EU countries, consisting of 61 regions. And the survey measured environmental behaviors in energy, transport, and food sectors. And they also assessed their support for environmental policies. With this dataset, we used multi-level latent class analysis to identify population segments with distinct behavioral patterns and then map them regionally to observe the within and between country variations. Next. So our multi-level analysis results highlight the sobering reality across all sectors. So the majority of the individuals, what we found is that they all fall into the least sustainable population segments. So from the energy sector, 78% of the participants were actually either disengaged energy users with minimal engagement in any sustainable energy behaviors, or energy investors who lacked smart meters, even though they invest a lot in the energy efficiency. In the transport sector, 61% were the auto travelers who are completely car dependent. And in terms of food, we have 51% who are non-sustainable food consumers and purchasers. And they are frequently eating meat and had very minimal sustainable purchasing behaviors, such as buying in-season food or food products with minimal packaging. And regarding their policy support, these least sustainable segments usually had lower policy support than the more sustainable ones. Next. And then based on our exploratory cross-sector analysis, the behavior patterns are actually linked across the sectors. Specifically, it meant that if you show unsustainable behaviors in one sector, you are also likely to behave unsustainably in another. So here, as you can see in this diagram, disengaged energy users, so one of the least sustainable segments in energy sector, they are associated with showing unsustainable food behaviors. And then similarly, those who are really car dependent, the auto travelers, are also very likely to be non-sustainable food consumers and purchasers. Next. And now looking across the regions, so coming to the multi-level element. So for all the three sectors, the regions are grouped based on the different percentages of population segments with distinct behavioral patterns. And according to our analysis, the regions typically group by country, which means the national context matters. So here we are going to use the case of energy sector to illustrate. So our analysis in this energy example, we found 4 region groups of energy population segment makeup. So we call them region group A, B, C, and D. And here you can see the visualization of region group D and region group A. So having smart meters is a key defining behavior of our most sustainable energy segments, which is called engaged energy users. So what we found here is that across country, so the cross-country differences are aligned with the policy differences in the published evidence. So the examples as shown here is that some EU countries like France, the Netherlands, and then the UK have their majority regions in region group D. So they have quite strong smart meter mandates. Like within the EU, they have the EU smart meter mandate. And in comparison, Belgium actually has most of its regions in region group A, with 0% of these engaged energy users. So you can see they have only 3 slices there, and then with 0% of engaged energy users. So this is quite interesting because despite its EU membership, they still have very little uptake of smart meters at that time. So if you look at the policy documents, there was actually a lack of implementation targets in Belgium for smart metering. Next. And then if you look at the within country comparison, then we also observe some within country differences, and they are actually aligned with the contextual differences documented in the existing literature as well. So here, British Columbia, again, we are still using the energy example and then also focusing on the smart meter use adoption. So British Columbia is in energy region group D. Again, they have a 30.3% of engaged energy users. And in comparison, other Canadian regions, they are mostly found in region group B. They have only 6.8% of such engaged energy users. And if you look at the published evidence, British Columbia had advanced smart meter infrastructure rollout since 2011. And at the same time, Ontario and Quebec actually had their infrastructure in place, but have lower adoption of smart metering. So this shows that how the policy is implemented in regions within countries actually matters. Next. So we have 3 major implications. So for the first is that we actually need tailored approaches as shown in our individual results. So we have about 51 to 78% of the population in unsustainable population segments. And these people need behavior change interventions. At the same time, we also have small sustainable minorities who need maintenance support. And then secondly, the cross-sector coordination is also essential. So since behaviors cluster, we need coordinated strategies across the energy, transport, and food, and to break down the policy silos. Next, please. And thirdly, we would like to propose a systematic policy transfer framework to move from the ad hoc policy transfer to evidence-based approach. So it starts from collecting more objective, better data, and then to identify the population segments with different behavioral patterns and to map the interventions according to the minority or the majority of the sustainable or unsustainable segments, and then compare the regions to look for opportunities for policy transfers, and finally to validate whether the transfer is successful or not. So with climate targets looming and most individuals stuck in unsustainable patterns, we can't afford more failures in policy transfers. So this framework offers a systematic path forward, moving from copying what worked elsewhere to understanding why it worked and where it can work again. So the strategy is clear. Use systematic segmentation to match interventions to actual populations and context. Next, please. And so this presentation is only a snapshot of what we've done. And please, everyone, find out more about our study using this QR code. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Okay, we have a few minutes now for questions and answers. I'm not sure if we've had any submitted, but the one at the top here, we have a question from Sarah Alley. What are successful examples of behavioural policy being used to correct or nudge positive behaviours in public transportation? George, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Susan. Yeah, okay, so a couple of thoughts here. We did some work at TRL recently on moments of change. This was in partnership with the Behavioural Insights team. And that moments of change are really kind of major life events. So things like moving house or having a child, changing job, maybe health related events as well, things like that. And basically the theory is that when you're sort of going through these moments of change, you're more susceptible to making other changes as well. So from a policy perspective, they can be useful moments to harness and increase the effectiveness of interventions. And I think obviously the sort of scale of effect differs between specific interventions in question, but I think in general the evidence shows that is quite a useful thing you can do. Another example that I quite like is around the walking bus concept, where I think there's some evidence for effectiveness in Scotland and other places, and that's basically where a kind of community initiative gathers together to help groups of children, in this case, walk to school in a kind of, a bus movement, and that's designed to make it more motivating, make it feel safer, help with navigation, overcome some of those barriers that might otherwise be in the way with walking to school. That means people might drive instead. And there's similar concept with bike buses as well. Yeah, there's a couple of thoughts.
Thanks, George. Okay, now on to something completely different. The next question here is from Victoria Lee. There are many behavioural models in existing literature. Which ones are the most used and why? Robert, would you like to take that and introduce yourself? Actually, I should have asked George you to introduce yourself as you speak. Thanks.
Yeah. I'm Robert West, Professor Emeritus of Health Psychology at University College London, and have been working on a couple of the BRUK projects, and co-author of the CONV model and the prime theory of motivation. Actually, what's very interesting is that the most widely used behavior change models are ones that focus on motivation. They're things like theory of planned behavior, subjective expected utility theory, which is a model of decision making. They're both actually models of decision making, really. There's operant learning theory, which is used very much in sort of things like clinical psychology and addictions. And there's things like self-determination theory, health belief model, and so on. These are all very widely used, but when you look at them, they all very much focus on motivation. There's a few that focus on the environment and the sort of physical and social environment in which we operate, so social learning theory and so on. And then within the fields of education and training and skill development and ergonomics, you've got ones that focus on capability. But what you won't see out there very much are models that use all three, except for with a, I blush to say this, but the COM-B model, and that was the whole point of the COM-B model, was that it was designed to cover all the different factors, not just the individual motivational factors, but the environmental, social, and capability factors that can influence behavior. Now, and I've been hunting around for other sorts of models that are like COM-B. The only one that I think is in fairly widespread use is one called the precede-proceed model, which is an implementation model, really, primarily in the field of health. But I think that so what I guess I'm saying to you is that one of the weaknesses, I think, over the decades of our field has been this sort of assumption that what we need to do to change people's behavior is primarily to change their motivation. And we could do that by informing them, educating, and so on, indirectly, or by threatening them or promising rewards and so on. Where in fact what we need is a much more systematic and systemic approach. So that's where the COM-B model comes in. And the idea of the COM-B model is not to replace all these other models, but to provide a broader framework in which you can see how they fit together, and so that you can come up with a more comprehensive and informed view.
Thanks, Robert. We've got 3 more questions on the table, but what I suggest is we go on to the next 2 talks, both of which are in different ways related to policy. And then we come back to these questions and any other questions that people have, either from listening to the presentations or indeed the answers to the questions. So we next have Amy Rodger, Dr. Amy Rodger, Statistics versus Anecdotes, Assessing the Effect of Evidence Types on Policy Support. Amy.
Thank you, Susan. So I'm going to be talking about work that we've done using experiments to try and understand how different types of evidence affect policy support. Next slide. And the reason that we were interested in this is because a lot of the societal challenges, especially those that BRUK are interested in around climate change and public health, and so on, we need policies for behaviour change that changes kind of population behaviour at a large scale. But often a lack of policy support for even effective policy measures can hinder the implementation of these measures. So a nice example from the OECD is taxing meat and seafood, which can potentially be an effective measure to reduce carbon emissions, but has low levels of support even with those with high environmental concern. Next slide. And we found some really great work by James Reynolds and colleagues at Aston University with a meta-analysis showing that if we communicate evidence about policy effectiveness, this may be an effective policy measure to enhance public support around those policies that we think are going to be effective. And this infographic is just an example of evidence on the impact of taxes around childhood obesity. And what we wanted to do is expand on this work, looking at more policy areas, as well as looking at different types of evidence. So not just what the impact of kind of positive evidence on effectiveness is, but also evidence of ineffectiveness and narrative statistical formats, as well as also what about those situations when we are dealt with conflicting information arguing for and against policy effectiveness, as often happens in our information environments like social media and the news. Next slide, please. And so we had 2 key research questions. The first was, what effect does exposure to different types of evidence about policy effectiveness have on support? And the second was about how do people reason with different types of evidence about policy effectiveness. Next slide, please. And to look at this, we ran 3 experiments. All the experiments had high-powered samples that were representative of UK voting age across age, gender, and political affiliation. And we had 7 different evidence conditions and policies, which I'll outline in a second. But the kind of core feature of the design of these experiments, to simplify it down, is that we measured people's prior support for a policy, asking how much they supported or opposed the implementation of a specific policy in the UK. We then presented them a piece of evidence about that policy's effectiveness or ineffectiveness, and we did a thought listing task, provided them an open box where they could list any thought that came to mind about the policy or the information they were reading, and then we re-asked them to list their policy support for that policy. Next slide, please. So in terms of policies, if we go next, in the orange boxes here, we wanted a wide array of policies that hadn't been rolled out nationally across the UK, across different types of societal challenges. So you can see energy quotas and taxing meat and seafood for thinking about climate and environmental issues. We have things like banning e-cigarettes, restricting merchandising on discretionary foods, health warning labels on alcohol for public health. As well as when we think about community safety and resilience, we looked at reducing speed limits to 20 miles an hour in urban areas and scanning of encrypted messages for illegal content regarding child online safety. And then for the evidence conditions that got paired with these policies, we had three core ones: a statistic, an anecdote for, and an anecdote against. And we're going to use reducing speed limits to give you an example of the types of information that got shown. So for statistics, we can see research shows this policy could significantly reduce collisions by 40% annually. And all of the statistics that we presented were based on studies on the efficacies of these interventions in the UK. Then for the anecdote for next, we had a member of the general public, a quote from them around what if they felt the policy would be effective and why. So here you can see that they think people will take it on board, they're going to slow down, people are sensible, and they'll just get on with it. Whereas for the anecdote against, you would have a member of the general public, a quote from them, arguing against it for a specific personal reason. So they doubt it will work without police actually enforcing it. People are going to ignore this measure. And we took these from qualitative research and reports from public citizens' juries around why people would support or not support these policies. And then we used these core conditions to create slightly more complex ones, which really just meant joining these two together. So you had this combined congruent condition where they saw two pieces of positive information about policy effectiveness from the statistic and the anecdote, and this more combined incongruent condition where we showed this conflict of positive statistical information, but a negative anecdote from the member of the public. And then we had a control condition where we simply just said that this policy was aiming to tackle a specific societal issue. And across the entire experiment, everyone saw each evidence condition paired with a different randomly selected policy. Next slide, please. So what did we find? Well, if you look at this example graph from one of the experiments, on the vertical axis, you can see change in support. And along the horizontal axis, you can see the different evidence conditions we've just gone over. The 0 red dashed line shows no change, and the blue dots and error bars show the mean and standard error. And so what we found was that across all study, evidence advocating for policy effectiveness, such as the statistic that's here as an example, as a reminder, as well as the anecdote fors, or both a combination of these, did not significantly increase or change policy support. Next slide. However, we did find that for the negative anecdote, policy support was significantly lower in this kind of anecdote against condition by about 5 to 7 points across all studies, which may seem small, but we have seen things like EU referendums be decided by very small percentage margins. And then when we go to the next slide, we'll see this incongruent condition where the conflicting information was presented. And what we found was quite inconclusive here, because in 2 out of the 3 studies, we found that pairing the statistic with the negative anecdote mitigated the negative anecdote effect. However, in one study, then we did not find this. So the negative anecdote effect persisted in one of the studies. So it's inconclusive, potentially around the role of conflicting evidence in changing these policy support beliefs. And if we go into the next slide, we'll start to think about this open text data that we had around what are people considering when we were being asked to make judgments about these policies and reading information about these policies. And the kind of key takeaway here is that just broadly, participants are mentioning a range of issues beyond policy effectiveness, from general beliefs around government and the role government should play, people's personal freedoms, to policy-specific qualities beyond effectiveness like fairness and What do they think about how this could be implemented? Is it possible to implement? How would people comply with it? Would it be enforced? And a range of these beliefs. And these are some examples for you. So this idea of personal choice when it comes to labelling on alcohol, and that people should be allowed to make their own decisions. And then beliefs around economic inequality attached to these policies, fairness, that restricting merchandising of discretionary foods, which is a lot of like the deals that you see in supermarkets, especially around like snack foods or more unhealthy foods, could make families who are currently already struggling put further burden on them. And so if we go on to the next slide, we'll now start to think about, so what are the kind of key takeaways and next steps from this research? Well, we found actually policy support was difficult to change for these policies, which across the board were not universally accepted in any of our samples and based on previous representative surveys. And so this kind of one touch point intervention just focusing on effectiveness didn't seem to work very well in this experimental setting. However, negative anecdotes decrease support. And so this is kind of, I think, an important piece that the behavioural research community could take on to try and replicate in more ecologically valid settings, thinking about things like social media simulation environments, because we know negative stories are gaining more traction and more frequency in news and media. We know people are more likely to engage with these. So I think it's important to take this out of an experimental setting and see if it replicates. And also further research should be done on what happens in the presence of conflicting information, so both for and against a particular argument as there was inconclusive results. More broadly, just reasoning about policies is influenced by factors beyond effectiveness, and we know this from the most recent theoretical frameworks of policy support, so this just adds some more empirical data to that sentiment, and therefore policy communication interventions should maybe address a broader range of issues than solely effectiveness that are relevant to that particular policy. But that was a super quick run through of what we did. And if you would like to see more about this, please check out our preprint, and thank you to the colleagues that worked on this project with me. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Amy. Good. Well, you've heard, as you say, very snapshot headlines of the 5 what we call demonstration projects for the first 18 months. We'll be having a webinar next year so that you can hear about the more substantial pieces of work we'll be doing going forward. If I could ask, we've got the last presentation from Dr. Lucy Porter, also relevant to policy, which was translating behavioural science advice into policy during a public health emergency, a behavioural perspective. Lucy, over to you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much, Susan. Hi, everybody. So yeah, as said, I'm going to be talking about a project that focused on translating behavioural science advice into policy during a public health emergency. First, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Lisa Zhang and Nia Koop, who are the main researchers on this project alongside myself. Also to Susan, who supported the oversight of the project, and also to our study advisory group of SPI-B advisors and our co-authors for their support and input. So if we could move on to the next slide. So this particular public health emergency doesn't really need much of an introduction. I'm talking about the COVID-19 crisis period of 2020 to 2022. As many of us probably remember, a lot of policies to reduce transmission of the virus relied on public behaviour change. So examples include staying at home during lockdowns or when showing symptoms, using face masks, getting vaccinated, etc., etc. But there were also policies that relied on behaviour change among groups of professionals, such as healthcare professionals and other key workers. So in recognition of the importance of behaviour change, in England, the Scientific Pandemic Insights Group on Behaviours, or SPI-B, provided advice to the UK government through the official Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE. And SPI-B was mainly made up of academic advisors who were there to provide independent scientific advice to the government. However, at the time and subsequently, concerns have been raised about the extent to which this advice was used by the government. And so this project aimed to set out and investigate this using scientific methods. So if I could have the next slide, please. So these are our core research questions. So if we tap forward to the first one, We started out by exploring what advice SPI-B provided. So before we can decide whether that advice was used, we need to understand what the advice actually was. And we did this by reviewing the advice reports produced by SPI-B. So next, please. We also wanted to understand where that advice went. So here we analysed meeting minutes from the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies to see whether SPI-B's advice was discussed there and then where that advice was sent afterwards. So if we just move on to the next one, this really speaks to the main question that I'm talking about today. And sorry, tap forward again. So this is the question of how SPI-B advice was communicated, engaged with, and used. Now here we use two different methods to collect information, and I'm going to talk you through that now. So if we move to the next slide. So for this project, as I said, we used two different sources of information or data. So one was secondary data. So here we were looking at transcripts from witnesses to the UK's COVID-19 public inquiry. And we also collected primary data by conducting interviews with SPI-B advisors and representatives from the UK Civil Service, the devolved nations of Scotland and Wales, and local government teams. So on one hand, we had these public inquiry transcripts in which we were mainly hearing from senior politicians and other people who were really close to the centre of decision making. But of course, this was taking place in a legal context in a public setting. So this is why we supplemented this with our own interviews, which took place in a research setting, which guaranteed more anonymity and hopefully provided a space for our participants to speak freely. And then after reviewing and analysing both of these sets of transcripts separately, we synthesised the findings into one set of themes, and I'm going to talk you through those now. So if we move to the next slide. So the first theme speaks to this core question of, was SPI-B advice used or not? So some people felt that it had been, particularly in relation to their personal experiences of using it and within their teams. Some reported that yes, to an extent, but not, it hadn't been used enough. So for example, around providing financial support to enable people to stay at home during lockdown and when symptomatic. The amount of financial support provided was not considered to be enough. It was difficult to access and so on. But if we just move to the next slide, we also received clear reports from some that SPI-B advice had not been used in certain instances. So in this example on the screen, I appreciate this is a long quote, but again, you can access these slides afterwards if you would like to look in more detail. So this comes from an email from a Cabinet Office official that was submitted to the inquiry, where they reported that decision makers were not engaging with behavioural scientists and they weren't engaging with the advice from SPI-B when developing key media campaigns. So I'm now going to explore why this might have been the case with the rest of our themes. Thank you. So this first one I want to talk to you about focuses on the processes of generating and disseminating that advice. So obviously, before advice can be used, it has to actually reach the relevant teams and advice users. Now, participants and witnesses described both formal routes of disseminating scientific advice, such as SAGE advice and SPI-B advice. And this, for example, may have been through the SAGE and SPI-B secretariats, who sent the advice out to relevant departments and organisations. There were also reports of more grassroots and ad hoc systems of disseminating advice, such as some teams who took it upon themselves to synthesise and share the advice from SPI-B and SAGE through their own networks. However, it didn't always arrive where it needed to. It didn't always get to the people who needed to see it, which we can see in the quotes on the screen here at the moment. So at times it appears that the dissemination process may have been a little bit patchwork. But of course, once the advice has been received, it then needs to be engaged with and used. And that's what the next theme starts to explore. So if I can have the next slide, please. So this theme really talks about the ecosystem of behavioural and social science advice. SPI-B was not the only group providing behavioural science advice, and it's really important to note that many people pointed out that this is a feature of the system, not a bug. It's a good thing if we have lots of sources of scientific evidence and advice. But unfortunately, we also saw reports that this wealth of different inputs maybe led to it being treated as a chance for cherry picking or shopping for evidence that fit a particular goal or outcome. And alternatively, sometimes it was misunderstood as an issue of there being lots of competing advice sources, rather than this being a chance for synthesis of the different sources of advice. And this really relates to the next theme of scientific culture and capability within government. So the openness to receiving scientific advice from scientific advisors seems to vary across organisations and teams. And we noticed that this openness to science seemed to be higher among those organisations and teams that were perhaps already a little bit more research active. And this also links to the question of scientific capability within government. We saw reports that this may have impacted the commissioning of advice, such as perhaps asking the wrong questions, for example, but also occasions where there were accidental misinterpreting and misunderstanding of the advice once it had been received. So if we just move on to the next slide, now this next key theme was really focusing around trust and collaborative working. So overall, we found that working relationships and common goals were hugely important. And there were many examples of really positive working relationships between SPI-B advisors, behavioural scientists within government, and the civil servants that they were supporting. But unfortunately, there was also a case of growing mutual distrust between SPI-B and politicians as time went on. And the people that we spoke to reported about this going in both ways. So perhaps sometimes the distrust was a result of SPI-B advisors speaking on social media or in the traditional media about the government's approach, but it also worked the other way as well. We did get reports of government officials publicly denigrating SPI-B as well. So if we move on to the next slide, perhaps moving away from the focus on SPI-B in particular, looking at an issue and a problem for behavioural science as a whole was the fact that it wasn't always prioritised. So sometimes this was due to, it just wasn't aware of it being on the radar, a lack of awareness that behavioural science would be relevant to the problem at hand. So the quote on the screen, for example, is about someone talking about how, the focus was really on getting a number of COVID tests delivered, but they weren't necessarily thinking about what would happen behaviourally when those tests were received. And then on other occasions, behavioural science was on the radar, but perhaps it wasn't prioritised because it wasn't seen as reliable or useful as a discipline as a whole. So real perceptions around behavioural science as a challenge there. So on the next slide, this next theme just talks about, in general, the complexity, the pace, and the pressure during the pandemic. So this affected a range of issues. So the dissemination of advice, for example, was affected by high turnover in roles, changes to systems. This disrupted dissemination chains such as mailing lists. But also, of course, there was a huge volume of work, constant change, high pace, and that meant that it was really hard to adapt, to do things differently by taking on those behavioural science advice. And I think this also emphasises the importance of embedding these principles during so-called peacetime. When we did hear from people who said that they had used the advice, they often reported that this aligned really well with the way they did things normally as well. So on the next slide, the final theme I want to talk about, it just comes back to SPI-B advice again. So specifically, some people reported that SPI-B advice didn't fit with the political approach of those senior decision makers. So in this case, the advice made sense, but politically it just wasn't acceptable. On the other hand, others talked about the fact that the SPI-B advice was sometimes seen as too vague, it dealt in much broader principles, it wasn't specific enough, and importantly, it didn't provide policy examples. But before we note this down as something that SPI-B and other scientific advisors need to change, I just want to draw your attention, so on the next slide, please. So just draw your attention to some reports from SPI-B advisors who pointed out that they did actually have those policy examples in the original reports, but before they were sent forward, they were asked to take them out by senior advisors within the system. And this was because it was seen as beginning to stray too closely into scientists setting what the policy should be. So just to move on to the next slide and to briefly talk to you about our next steps, we're in the process of developing recommendations. These are being extracted from transcripts, so we're really taking recommendations that come from the witnesses to the inquiry and from the participants in our interviews and what they think needs to change. And these recommendations really do span the entire pipeline, right from the scientific advisors and what they or we could do differently, all the way through to the advice users, policy teams, etc., and what could potentially change there. And we've held 3 sense-checking workshops with stakeholders to get their input, and we're currently revising that final list of recommendations. And I'd also just like to shout out that this stage has been led by Lisa, who is our fantastic research assistant on this project, who's currently doing her PhD at the University of Bath. So just on the last slide then, thank you all very much for listening. Hope you enjoy the rest of this webinar, and yeah, be really pleased to take any questions from you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And yes, if I could get the other panelists to come back and join us. And just to say, we've called this Q&As, but obviously we would like to hear comments and your feedback. So don't feel you have to pose everything as a question. So please do keep them coming. So the next one we have is, what is behavioural research doing? From Tom Fraser, this is. What is behavioural research doing to understand the sources of disinformation? And I think Linda and also David are happy to take this one. So thank you.
So I'll make a start and hand over to David. Such an important issue. So we are actively doing work on information integrity, which is a term that is commonly used because mis and disinformation are contested terms. We work with the scientific, social and behavioural science, social and behavioural research for emergencies group, which is convened by Go Science, who are also looking at this theme. And we're just beginning to scope out some work for Go Science on information integrity. So that's a live project, and it relates to a question that Tim Chadbourne asked as well, and that I responded to in the Q&A box. There is also active work going on across different research communities that we're connecting to. And just a plug for work that BR UK was credited on, we're publishing, the Scottish Government is publishing a health information integrity strategy in the next few weeks. So please look out for that, which will be a world first actually for a country publishing a strategy on this. But David, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I can't talk directly to work on the sources of mis and disinformation, but there's been some interesting recent work about appropriate responses to it. So the Cabinet Office Behavioural Insights team put out a useful document called The Wall of Beliefs, which effectively says that trying to directly discredit beliefs is not a particularly constructive approach, that beliefs are quite socially complex things which relate to our senses of identity and a whole range of different elements. And so the idea that all we have to do is correct misinformation is no longer thought to be productive. It just drives the salience of those. So I would refer you to the Wall of Beliefs document, but I think that more broadly, the question around the sources of this comes to a kind of wider fragmenting of kind of social understandings, which we're seeing in many areas, but we're not directly working on that.
Thanks very much. And yes, it's frustrating that we can't have a two-way conversation on here, but if the person who asked the question wants to follow up, or we haven't quite answered what you're trying to get at, please just do type in again. I mean, obviously sources of misinformation, disinformation is sources of information. And we know a lot of the problem arose through social media and still is playing itself out in social media. But I'm not sure if that was what you were trying to get at. As I said, do come back on that if you'd like to. Our next one up is, from Joe Gitchell. Hello, Joe. Have you found a useful or effective way to navigate or bridge differences prompted by the holding of different values? I presume you mean sort of different values simultaneously. And I wonder, is this one for David Lagnado and Amy Rodger? Did your project speak to this? Or is there anybody else on the panel who'd like to talk to this one?
I can, Amy, if we looked at values a bit in our experiments, actually, so we could answer something more specifically. I mean, more generally, it's a really difficult question, and there's quite a lot of research looking at values. I mean, presumably you mean a whole range of things that can count as values, but I mean, Amy, did we had a little look at this in our study, didn't we? Or
we had a slight look at this because obviously we were trying to change a very specific belief, but what we found is kind of the effects that we had were across the board. So someone who really supported the policy originally reduced their support, as well as someone who didn't like it. So we couldn't really say too much because we weren't trying to get them to collaboratively come to the same belief or come to a compromise. We were just changing individuals. But like Dave says, I think there's been some really interesting work from looking at, conversations with LLMs to bringing people into consensus discussions, with using things like implementation intentions to prompt collaboration rather than dissent opinion. So there's a lot of great work out there, but our work specifically didn't look on it.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Robert?
Yeah, I think that one of the things Joe may be getting at here is where you have contested areas, such as, for example, e-cigarettes is a classic one in public health, where you have different experts coming to it from different perspectives. And this presents a bit of a challenge for policymakers who are having to sort of navigate that, and policymakers will have their own value systems and so on that they apply to it. And I think it is an interesting area that, those of us who work in the field of tobacco control are very familiar with, but I guess also arises and maybe becomes somewhat to the forefront in some other areas where, for example, I mean, with COVID, obviously we saw this actually as well, where the government was getting advice from SPI-B and SAGE and so on, but it was also getting advice from other quarters that somewhat conflicted with that, and those were from academics. I mean, it wasn't just sort of people who were pretending to be academics. So I think this is an interesting area probably for BRUK to have a look at going forward, because so a lot of the areas we deal with, it's not really contested that much. The values are all pretty much in alignment, but there are some very important ones where that's not the case.
Thanks. And the next question we have down here is from Rabia Karakaya. Do you think behavioural models like the behaviour change wheel could also be useful for improving public acceptance and trust in emerging technologies? So as a co-author of the behaviour change wheel, I might just say a couple of points on this. The first is the behaviour change wheel is a framework rather than a model, because model includes relationships within it. So the combi model sits at the heart of the behaviour change wheel, but the behaviour change wheel is a framework. It's actually quite difficult because people are taking, actually, if you could just leave the comments up, it'd be really helpful, because it's been taken off the screen and put under answered, I think now. But anyway, it was saying, is it helpful in relation to trust and acceptance of technologies? Well, frameworks, in a way, are themselves technologies. I think they can help trust and acceptance in terms of providing a structure for people to think about things, and also if a framework has been developed in quite a systematic and comprehensive way, as the behaviour change wheel was, it gives quite a comprehensive picture of all the different things that may be levers that could be used in approaching a situation. So from that point of view, it may increase acceptance and trust. But in itself, I think it's better to think about frameworks as organising systems. In itself, I don't think it directly impacts on trust and acceptability. I don't know what other people think. And there was another related question. Again, it's gone into the answer, because if anybody types on here, it goes away, and so we can't have a collective discussion on it. But I can come back to that one.
Susan,
but it was yeah.
Susan, I can add to what you just said if you like, and give a concrete example.
Yeah,
because I think you're right. In theory, that the behaviour change wheel or models like it are very useful to hopefully plan and improve people's trust in new technologies before they arrive. But often what we find is we're doing it post hoc. So there's a great example of a relatively old technology now called intelligence speed assistance, which is in all new cars sold in Europe now. It's a fantastic technology. When people use it, they love it. When they get it working, what it does is it basically keeps your car under the speed limit when it's working well, which is most of the time. But we know that people often lack the capability to know how to turn it on. We also know that they lack the motivation. In fact, we hear of car dealers telling people how to turn it off because they assume that drivers don't want it. And then until very recently, the system itself, this is the opportunity element of COM-B, defaults to off. So you have to remember to turn it on every time you start your car. Now that's changing with new regulations, but it demonstrates how if we could plan that in advance using a framework like the behaviour change wheel, we'd be in a much better situation. So in principle, yes, and there are examples of it working well, but often post hoc.
Great, thanks. Really helpful. I've now found the comment, again, sort of to do with trust, but to do with behavioural research. And it's from Victoria Clement. It was mentioned behavioural science was not seen as reliable. How can we make behavioural science more reliable and seen more positively by non-behavioural scientists? I think this is an absolute key question. And I don't know if anybody on the panel would like to address that. It obviously came, and Lucy, you've commented on it within by text, by writing, but I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about how we make behavioural science seen as more reliable. I mean, one of the things I think is really important is ensuring that we don't speak in jargon, that we speak in very clear language, that we really think about the audiences we're talking to, that we start from where they are and think about how can behavioural research or how can behavioural science address their problems, improve their situation, answer their questions, etc., rather than come in often with quite technical language and sometimes not really having enough of a sense of who our audience is, what their motivations are, what their level of comprehension, understanding, etc. is. So briefly, and then we can move on to the next question, Harriet, and then Robert.
Yes, just to echo what you were saying, Susan, I think the communication aspect is really important. But I think in order to ensure that, the work that we're doing is reliable, we need to consider all stages of the process. So, there's a lot of initiatives going on in replication of our findings. I think the work we were talking to about using ontologies in order to bring lots of evidence and knowledge together so that we have more robust answers to the questions that we're looking at, and essentially improving the confidence in our findings. Then, as you said, Susan, in terms of how we're reporting, making sure that we're reporting things accurately, clearly and consistently, and then that hopefully can be disseminated to those people who need to use behavioural research in practice. So yes, just to echo what you're saying, and I think, making sure that at each stage of our research process, we are ensuring that what we're doing is reliable and communicated and reported clearly.
Great, thank you. Robert?
Yes, I think that a fundamental possible mindset shift needs to take place both within behavioral science and in users of behavioral science, and that is to recognize really explicitly that we're much more like meteorology than we are like physics, or at least maybe more like particle physics than Newtonian physics. Everything we do, because of the nature of the subject matter, is going to be around probabilities. Sometimes they can be specified very precisely and sometimes less precisely. But essentially, people rely on weather forecasts even though they know that they're not always accurate, and they understand the reasons for that. And I think so. If in the way that we work, us and our statistics, we move towards Bayesian approach, for example, as opposed to classical statistics, and we treat our subject matter as probability distributions, and we communicate the probabilistic nature of our subject matter better to the public, then I think we will do a better job and we'll get better buy-in.
Thanks, Robert. And actually in the chat, if people have just seen, the next webinar is going to be on surfacing and mitigating the hidden risks of AI. So the whole issue of trust will come into this one also. Is being presented by two people from the Cabinet Office. I think will be a very good webinar, so do join that. Okay, so the next question, we've just got a few minutes left. The next question is quite a lengthy one from Maria Hearing. I think the statistical, or maybe it's just a point, we'll get to that. I think the statistical negative positive arguments work on different levels. For example, I think the negative anecdote plays on a different level, for example, to the statistical evidence argument. The statistical evidence argument suggests that the policy is useful because following it will have positive effects, reduce collisions, while the negative anecdote does not comment on the quality of the policy itself, but suggests that the policy will not work for a superordinate reason because people will not follow it. Bracket, so a compliance issue rather than strictly policy efficacy. I wonder if the fact that these two arguments play on different levels did not impact on the results. Now, is that in reference to David and Amy's project?
Yes, happy to take this one. Really astute question, and something that we discussed internally after experiment 1 as well. And I think to say that we did in further iterations closely match the kind of mechanism of the argument there. So the kind of particular point they were making about how or why that the policy might work, and we didn't find these effects. And also to say that it was only explanatory of potentially why the negative anecdote would have worked, but we would have expected a balanced effect, so like the positive anecdote to work in the other direction, and we didn't find that too. So if you look at the preprint and the discussion, we cover a lot of different kind of explanatory mechanisms for why we might be seeing the effects that we're seeing across the board. But just to say, we did consider this ourselves, and that's what I'll say on that very briefly, as I know we're coming to time, and I'll hand over to Dave.
Yeah, just to add, we thought quite a lot about actually the kind of causal model that people will have when they evaluate a policy, and at what point different problems might arise, i.e. for the anecdotes. So actually your question, I think, about the different levels is something that we were planning to follow up on, but we made sure it didn't kind of like confound our results. But I think it's a great question, and something that, one of the things that we really want to continue looking at.
Thanks very much. And a couple of comments and directions to papers on including values in research on food waste from Guanyu Captain. So thank you very much. And finally, we'll take a question from Valsti Hale. And this is for you, Lucy and Lisa. When did your research take place? Was it long after the pandemic? Wondering about the impact of recall. I imagine that there might be more of a skew than on other projects due to the divisions and psychological pressure on people at the time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Basti. That's a really good question. So we were conducting our interviews over the last year, and that was around the same time that the COVID inquiry was taking place as well. So yes, it was certainly a few years after that crisis period. We did also say to our interviewees, we appreciate that this might be quite a long time since you were in this situation. We also appreciate that for some people they might have essentially put it in a bit of a locked box in their mind, but we did find that as we were speaking to people, they were really saying how the more they spoke about it, the more they were remembering things from the pandemic. I know that a lot of our interviewees as well, they prepared by looking back over emails and refreshed their memories of what had happened during the pandemic as well, and looking to see whether or not they had actually received any advice from SPI-B into their inboxes. We also, I wasn't able to mention this, but from where we had synthesized the advice from SPI-B in that earlier stage of the research, we did also have kind of a set of key advice statements that we were interested in talking to our interviewees about to see whether they recalled those being engaged with and used. But yeah, you're right. I think it's certainly a potential limitation of the work, that it was something we had to explore subsequently. But yeah, thank you very much for that great question.
And just to add, as somebody who was a participant and also an advisor on SPI-B, even after the formal bit of SPI-B was shut down, most of the people carried on very actively in writing articles, in giving talks, in panel discussions, in various kinds of dissemination, because the problem was still going on. And indeed, we have 2 new variants and a new wave starting now. So I think it's, I think a lot of the experiences were sort of carried forward in quite a live way in people's minds. So thank you for those questions and points. So excellent, very good discussion, and thanks to all the presenters. There's a feedback form just been shared with you, so please do fill that out, because the more we hear from you about your response to our webinars and also any ideas you have for future webinars, the more that we can provide webinars that will be interesting and useful to you. In a few days' time, the recordings, but also just the slides will be on there. And do go on the website, do sign up for the newsletter, because there'll be the dates and topics of future webinars coming up on the newsletter also. So thank you again, everybody, for taking part, and hope to see many of you, or hear from many of you at our next webinar. Thank you very much. Goodbye.